Much, Richard. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you on this topic. We're going to make it quite a practical session in terms of suggestions for approaching mediation in the classroom, but also we're going to introduce the concept itself and really explore what it means. So I'll start with answering this or approaching this question: what is mediation? In the context of the communicative needs of our learners in the 21st century and why it might be relevant for language classes. And then look at how it actually occurs in the classroom. It's something that I believe already occurs in the communicative classroom, so we can look at how that manifests and relate that to the can-do statements in the CEFR. And then we can, in the final part, look at considerations for taking a more conscious approach to promoting mediation activities in the classroom and building learners' confidence in this area. So without further ado, let's look at the key question. What do we mean by mediation? Why is this a topic now that we're discussing? And before I really focus on that, I would like to broaden the viewpoint and think about how we describe communication in general. It is a feature of how we describe communication, and real-world communication involves a range of skills working together to achieve a communicative outcome. In applied linguistics, we tend to break that down into skills and sub-skills in order to analyze what's happening, but also to develop approaches for teaching languages and testing them. And so I've given this metaphor here of a prism. We're looking at language through a prism when we describe it in terms of different skills. And we're very used to talking about 4 skills of listening, speaking, writing, and reading. This is a convenient way to organize activities and to also organize assessment, communicative assessment. But we all know that there are other aspects that we look at connected to these, such as phonology, which might be receptive phonology for listening or productive for speaking, grammatical control and knowledge of grammar, underlying accuracy in speaking and writing, and vocabulary range, which might be reinforced by reading, but then is important in the productive skills. So when we break down language ability in this way, it informs the activities that we design for the classroom. And we'll be familiar with promoting listening skills with comprehension tasks with audio, using drills and repetition to develop pronunciation. And when it comes to the productive skills, such as speaking and writing, there are things we do in the classroom that still involve a range of sub-skills. And we might set up pair work with partners looking at a text, maybe processing something they've listened to or read, and then presenting about that. Or in writing, we might plan strategically what ideas are going to go into a piece of writing and how to structure paragraphs and how to get your point across. And so it shows that these categories are in some ways a simplification, a convenient simplification that we use, and that successful real-world communication is still something greater than the sum of its parts. When we look at group work that we do in the class, is this just listening followed by speaking, followed by listening, followed by speaking, or is there something more happening in the way that in an interaction, we build on the things that we've understood that other people have said and build new ideas together. Similarly, if you are researching a topic to write an essay in the library, is this just reading followed by writing? Or is there something more happening in the way that you select and process ideas and reformulate them, synthesize information from different sources, and so on? And of course, as teachers, if you look at what a teacher is doing in the classroom, is this when you're moving around, listening to students, maybe giving instructions, looking at what they've written, writing your own notes, There's a lot going on there in concert, and is this just 4 separate skills happening in sequence, or is something more happening in teaching skills? So another way of looking at successful communication, proposed by the Common European Framework of Reference, is to break it down into modes of communication. So it describes what learners can do communicatively in the languages they know. And significantly, this is applicable to any language. It's language agnostic, but that means that the focus is very much on the communicative outcomes of what they can do. And so the categories we see in the CFR are reception, which includes listening and reading, comprehension, production, which is formulating your message, interaction, where you'll be responsively interacting in a dialogue, and mediation, which goes one step further, and I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. But we also see language competences described in the CEFR, which encompasses all of those systemic aspects of phonology, grammatical control, lexical control. And then we as educators, when we are looking at a specific language like English, we then supply the detail on that through instruments such as the Global Scale of English or the core inventory by the British Council. And there are things such as signing competences described in the CFR for sign language, and plurilingual and pluricultural competences. Your ability to muster your different repertoire of languages in communicative situations, and your repertoire of cultural knowledge to achieve successful communication, which is increasingly relevant in international contexts. But for the purpose of today, we are, of course, zooming in on mediation, which I haven't summarized yet. But it has been extended as a concept in the CFR and been given a lot more detail, and that's why this is news at the moment. Let's zoom in on those 4 modes of reception, production, interaction, and mediation. We said that reception can be can involve listening or reading comprehension, and in this example with the girl there in the airport, she might be doing both in that situation, checking up on her mobile and listening to announcements. Production is very much about planning what you're going to say and saying it, or what you're going to write and writing it, formulating your message, as this girl is in raising her hand and making a comment. Whereas in interaction, you are now responding to your interlocutor. There is an exchange going on. Mediation, because it is focused on the development of new meanings, it involves all 3 of the others, arguably, in different ways. And in a metaphorical sense, a metaphor I like to use quite often is that if we view interaction as a dance where you are responding to the conversational moves of your partner or your interlocutor, I would liken mediation more to jazz, where you might have a roll sheet together, but you are interpreting something in your own way and developing new ways of expressing it, and maybe feeding off your partner or the people you're communicating with to develop new ways of looking at concepts and expressing ideas. And a key part of that is taking into account the communicative needs of the people you're talking to or writing for. Now, this concept has been expanded in the CEFR in the Companion Volume, which Richard mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And that was launched last year, in 2018, in fact. But it is now something that people are looking at as a way of informing learning outcomes in teaching and learning. And the best way to look at this development in the CFR is that it's an expansion of the description of communicative competence. It doesn't replace what we had before, it enriches it. So we had a map of communicative activities in the CFR that has been given more detail and now includes mediation, which was always there as a concept, but now we have can-do statements at each level in a range of activities. So I'll break that down for you now. This is what we've been leading up to. So mediation activities in the CFR can be looked at in three ways. One of them is mediating a text. And this is where you have understood something and you reformulate it to help someone else understand it. So you might be relaying and conveying the content of something you have read or listened to. This could be summarizing or synthesizing, as I mentioned before, where you've got several sources and you're selectively synthesizing ideas and the message. So obviously very relevant to English for academic purposes, and also for English for specific purposes, for business English, where you might have presentation activities that reformulate ideas. But it's not just for those domains. It's relevant across all domains of communication, and also for low levels, where, as I say, you are commenting on something perhaps that you've read or listened to or watched and helping someone else understand it. Mediating concepts is very much about collaboration. Some of you may be familiar with Merrill Swain's concept of languaging, and I think this is very closely related to that. It's the talking through of ideas actually helps you formulate them more clearly, and the way that you respond to others in that discussion can develop new ways of looking at a concept or develop new solutions. So any kind of collaborative task that involves problem solving or maybe developing a proposal can involve mediating of concepts, where we reach a new conclusion through the languaging that we do as a group. And then mediating communication is perhaps closer to the dictionary definition that we're familiar with, because it does involve, for example, facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. But it also involves creating a space for intercultural understanding. The Council of Europe calls it pluricultural space, because pluricultural competence is, as I said before, your individual repertoire of cultural knowledge, and so by creating a space for that, you can facilitate intercultural dialogue, and you can act as an intermediary. So you can see that these are dealing at quite a high level in terms of describing what happens in successful communication, and you can think of sub-skills that contribute to that, and approach those in the classroom accordingly. So why is this relevant? I think in terms of the relevance for English language teaching and the needs of our learners in the 21st century, one of the interesting things about mediation is that we see that it deals with a lot of the aspects of what's often described as soft communication skills. And we see that the expectations of employers and in higher education, the expectations placed on candidates are that they have the capacity to collaborate, communicate, and exercise critical thinking and creativity. And of course, communication is central to the other four C's, sorry, the other three C's. And this becomes more important as we see the workplace changing, as we see the way communication occurs in the 21st century changing. And one of the things that's influencing this, arguably, is the integration of technology and artificial intelligence into the way we communicate in the workplace. So this is causing disruption to careers. We don't know exactly what the jobs of 2030 will look like, but the consensus is that there will be a greater emphasis on interpersonal skills, on collaboration, on teamwork, as the more mundane aspects of communication are dealt with with the help of artificial intelligence and such like. And so if we are to prepare our learners for the future, particularly in English, where the objective of learning English in the long term is usually a trajectory towards career opportunities, then it makes sense to be approaching these skills in a way that is manageable and broken down by level, so that we have something like that with the mediation descriptors, because they are concrete, they represent activities that you can turn into tasks in the classroom that have been validated at each level through questionnaires. So the can-do statements themselves from A1 to C2, we can be fairly confident that if we take one at B1, it's a reasonable learning aim for learners in a B1 course. And that's very useful, because one of the problems with this whole discourse of soft skills and 21st century skills is that it can be quite nebulous, and it can seem to rely almost totally on personal qualities, whereas we need to be able to break this down in a way that learners themselves can approach these activities in steps. And there are plenty of steps available in the CFR. If we look at this map here from the Companion Volume, it looks pretty overwhelming. There are 19 scales there for mediation that have been added. So each box represents a scale from A1 to C2 of descriptors, can-do statements. And the first reaction as a teacher might be, oh my God, have I got to teach all of this as well as everything I already teach? And of course, that's not the case. The CFR is a reference work, and it offers a range of descriptors that we might selectively make use of depending on our context. So we can explore the new scales, thinking in terms of, are there relevant statements here that I could set as learning aims and outcomes with my particular group, and I can confidently select them at the right level. But no, this is not something that everybody has to do all of, and it's there to be used interpretively and selectively. So to wrap up this introduction to the concept, I'll also talk about what mediation is not. It's not a fifth skill to add to listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It's better to look at it as we would look at interaction. It's a way of describing what happens with those skills, often when we integrate them, and in particular with mediation, where we create new ways of communicating ideas, new meanings. It's not a compulsory curriculum top down from the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe offers this as a resource. It is not actually something we have to look at, but it might be useful. It's not separate from other aspects of communication like interaction. It's better to think of it as shining a light on successful communication in terms of those aspects of it that are mediation activities. And it's obviously not a new phenomenon. You will see mediation happening in any good communicative lesson. And we're going to look at that in a moment with examples. So at this point, it might be a good time, if there are any burning questions, we will have a proper Q&A session at the end, but if there are any burning questions about the way I've explained the concept, then I can answer them here. And I think Richard will field, if if there were any of those questions.
Few seconds for people to ask questions, but one of the ones which I know has come up before when actually to this stage of looking at mediation before going into more detail is one viewpoint is, so isn't mediation just another word for integrated skills?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, the question of integration of skills, I think it's impossible to avoid an integration of skills in any communication. So it's not just about integrated skills. If you think about the way skills are integrated, even in a very controlled activity like a listening test, there's still some reading that the learners will probably do, and maybe a bit of writing as well. But that's not necessarily a mediation activity. Mediation does often involve the integration of skills because you might, as I say, be reformulating a message that you've understood from a text. But it's not interpreting. Interpreting is a specialist skill where you transparently translate what you've heard without adding or removing anything. Mediation is very different to that because you are thinking about the communicative needs of your interlocutor, of your audience, and you are tailoring the message accordingly. So in that sense, it is something more than just integrating skills.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that is actually a very helpful viewpoint on looking at how mediation works with the wider skills. We do have one example, and whether it's good for now, one question rather, whether it's good for now or later. Tim, can you give an example of a mediation activity?
Yes, I'm just about to give several examples.
Okay, great.
But yeah, I mean, okay, a mediation activity that you might be familiar with in an English language context. Let's take the task 1 of the IELTS writing test academic. In that task, you might be given a table of data, you might be given a diagram, you might be given a graph or something like that, and you'll be asked to explain that in a piece of writing for somebody. Take that and put it into a summary. That is a mediation activity, but it could equally be that you've watched a video and you're explaining it to your classmate. It could be that you've read something and you're turning that into a presentation. So these are mediating texts. But also we saw that a mediation activity could also be a collaboration task where maybe you're working in a team to come up with a product proposal. And the way you talk that through and build on other people's contributions involves a mediation of concepts.
Okay, thank you. We do actually have another question, which is around something I know that you may want to be tackling later on. Is if it's not a new skill, how would you recommend that exams approach the assessment of mediation?
Okay, so this is a big question because mediation has not been added to the CFR automatically to become a focus of assessment. It is often the case that we look at the CFR to benchmark assessment, and it may be that you want in your assessment to evidence skills that involve an aspect of mediation. So I think we have to take this step by step and not rush into it. We have to view the different domains in which mediation happens. And if we are building an assessment in that domain, is it relevant to benchmark the activity in the standard setting that we do to the mediation descriptors? But I think for teaching and learning and assessment for learning, it's directly relevant to think about learners' reflection on their own performances with can-do descriptors and statements, and the use of these can-do descriptors to provide success criteria that have a feed-forward effect, so that you can give recommendations on which areas to work on more and how to work on them. So I think the first point to look at is how we are incorporating success criteria into continuous assessment.
Thank you, Tim. We do actually have quite a few more questions come in, but I think perhaps some of the answers may come up as you go forward to the next half of the webinar. But there's a longer period at the end where we have for questions.
Okay. So we're going to move on to looking at examples of mediation happening in the classroom. And again, that sort of answers again one of the questions we just had, which was if we acknowledge that it already happens in a communicative classroom, can we think of examples of that? And so let's look at actual descriptors taken from the scales. Here's one at B1, can summarize simply in language B the main information content of straightforward texts in language A on familiar subjects. So you'll notice this language A and language B comes up quite a lot in mediation descriptors because it can signify two different languages, but it can also signify two different texts. So for example, if this girl has maybe read a piece of text that she is then explaining the content of to her partner in speech, that speech is the language A. So it doesn't have to be across different languages per se. It can be, but at higher levels, it might be across different registers as well. So it might be taking a formal text and explaining that in informal language to your partner, or vice versa. And you might even have a situation where this girl has sat down, she's missed the lesson, and the girl is explaining what the content of a lesson. And even that involves mediating a text in speech because she's taking the main points of that content and reformulating it in a way that her partner can understand. So it has a lot of application in terms of what already happens day to day in the communicative classroom with information gap, for example. Then mediating concepts, facilitating collaborative interaction with peers. That's a scale in this category. And if we take a B1+ descriptor, can collaborate on a shared task, for example, formulating and responding to suggestions, asking whether people agree, and proposing alternative approaches. That's quite a long descriptor. And again, it's looking at aspects of task achievement in a group task. But we can then approach that with learners in terms of preparing them with the useful language for formulating and responding to suggestions. Making them more self-aware before they begin of whether they are going to invite people in and ask them for their contributions and propose alternative approaches. And the descriptor itself, the purpose it serves is it shows us what we can reasonably aim to do with learners at B1+ in this kind of task. Then for mediating communication, the example I've illustrated here with the picture might be in a business English context. The scale is facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. That might apply to negotiation tasks. And at B2, the CFR says that learners should be able to summarize the statements made by the two sides, highlight areas of agreement and obstacles of agreement. And this has an implication for differentiated roles in group work. So you might have a situation where you revisit these types of tasks during a course and you rotate the roles that the different learners have, so that you may not be able to have someone moderating a discussion, every single person doing that on the same day, but you might be able to circulate that responsibility through the course so that all the learners get a chance to be in that role. And then we have mediating strategies. There are scales for that too, such as preparing successful communication or supporting it. So here, linking to previous knowledge, at B1, if you're doing a peer presentation, for example, can show how new information is related to what people are familiar with by asking questions. Now, as teachers, we're all very familiar with doing that. You might call it activating schemata or activating previous knowledge, but it's an important aspect of engaging an audience in a presentation. And so this is something that learners can be focused on and given pointers about. So this girl might be presenting an aspect of education and then asking her classmates about their own experiences with that to get them engaged with her peer presentation. And that's just one example, but there are numerous examples that we as teachers can recognize we do. And we now have descriptors of what we could expect our learners to do at each level. So thinking about level, this can apply also at lower levels. Here we have a descriptor for relaying specific information in speech at A2. And the descriptor itself says can relay in language B in a simple way a series of short, simple instructions, provided the original speech in language A is clearly and slowly articulated. So that's for us as educators to understand. You wouldn't present it in that way to young learners, for example, but it can happen in the classroom if you set up a routine where maybe pairs have an alternating responsibility to repeat back the teacher's instructions before each task and ensure that their partner has understood those instructions. That relaying of instructions in your own words is relaying specific information in speech. So that sort of routine could build learners' confidence in understanding something and then reformulating it for somebody. But equally, discovery learning with young learners, project-based learning, will include aspects of mediation without necessarily presenting this kind of descriptor to the learners themselves. So what I would argue is there are plenty of opportunities for mediation that already occur in the classroom. And when we acknowledge that, what we're saying here is not that, okay, so this is nothing new, let's ignore it. It's more that we now have the opportunity to focus on it more consciously, and we have descriptors to help us do that at each level. So to recap, we've looked at teamwork as an opportunity for mediation, and this is something we do regularly in the communicative classroom. We've looked at peer support. If one learner understands something more deeply than the other, then that can be an opportunity for them to explain. It can also be maybe an information gap. And presentation and leadership, we've looked at that. Again, probably in practical terms, to give learners a proper opportunity to lead a group or give a peer presentation in this way, you might be circulating that responsibility and revisiting the task on a regular basis. It depends on the hours you have with your learners and the time you have to devote to those sorts of tasks. But quite often it can be based on learners' own interests, what they bring to the classroom, starting with simple show and tell activities. Projects are a rich source of mediation activities because they will often involve researching a topic or gathering information somehow from their own survey. It might be that this leads to a product of some kind, a poster or a presentation or even a web page, a blog page. And in creating that and processing the things, the information that they've gathered, the learners can mediate a text. They may also be mediating concepts together in deciding how to approach the task. And I've already mentioned information gap. There are a huge number of ways that information gap can happen in the classroom. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have two different texts or jigsaw reading or something of that nature. It could be that in approaching a text in a class, you could allocate different responsibilities to learners to focus on different aspects of that same text that they're listening to or that they're reading, and then come together to explain what they have drawn from the text in their particular area of focus. So, for example, in reading a long news article, one learner might be focused on the chronology of events, and one learner might be focused on maybe the impact on the particular people of those events. And this, it's something that you can flexibly come up with. It doesn't have to be a part of the material itself. There are ways you can allocate different angles to look at text in the classroom. And of course, simulations can be a rich opportunity for mediation, because here you again might have a text you're working with that would be job applications or job advertisements, and you could differentiate roles where one learner is the careers advisor and the other is the applicant, and they look at these texts together and discuss the implications of the requirements of each job. And that again is mediating the text because it's expanding on what you see before you and discussing it. Yeah, I mean, I think these are options. They are not all things that we all have to do. There are just a range of options in the classroom that can be set up. And I would like to now focus on the considerations for a more conscious approach to developing these skills in the classroom with these types of activity. So if we acknowledge that you may do some or all of these things in your class already, a first step, if you've got to grips with mediation as a concept, is to just review what you do and identify those opportunities and ways that you could enhance your focus on mediation with those same activities. So I mentioned before with teamwork, the conscious differentiation of roles can give more opportunity for learners to think about how they are collaborating. And in simulations, you might have, for example, if you have a project to develop a proposal, let's say that they are designing a product that they want to advertise, you might have one person who is representing the finance department, one person who's representing the product development team, one who is the human resource department. That's at maybe a higher level with older learners, but it just illustrates how they can be thinking about different stakeholder viewpoints and taking those into account in the way that they discuss the solutions. And as I mentioned before, preparing learners with useful language for collaboration. It may not always be successful that you see them actually using it once you go into the activity, but it can certainly raise awareness of what the learners are focusing on, that they're not just focusing on accurate production, but they are focusing on how they build on the ideas of the other learners. And then by revisiting that after the activity, we looked at these examples of language of collaboration. I saw these examples in the task itself. Let's work on these and maybe do another task with further opportunities to use that language. It becomes quite a rich task sequence. And of course, success criteria can really be helpful for reflecting on how you did in a communicative activity, not just what you achieved, but how you achieved it. So mediation can-do descriptors can be simplified for the learners and presented as success criteria after each activity, and they can be invited to reflect on how confident they felt in doing those things, if you make space for that in the lesson. Peer presentations, again, I've just selected that as one of the examples. That's something you may already do if you have the time and the space in your course. But there's obviously an opportunity there for a research phase. And I mentioned before, this might leverage the interests of the learners themselves. And mediation can happen across languages, we've said that. And there's no reason why you can't have a research phase in L1 outside of the classroom, where they find the topic that they're interested in, that they want to present. As long as they are then thinking about how to present that topic in the target language, in English, then they are mediating that information, and it's a valid mediation activity in the English language classroom. And you can support that with models, videos of successful talks, thinking about how to structure the talk with strategies, as I mentioned before. Do you have techniques such as asking people about their own experience of the topic? And feedback, again, can involve success criteria in terms of mediating a text. How well did you get your point across, this kind of thing. So you can refer to the mediation can-do statements to inspire more simplified statements to share with your learners when they reflect on their success in those activities. So let me just let this slide load. It's taking a bit longer this time, but when it does load, it will show us an example of that simplification process. The CEFR is there as a tool. The Council of Europe it welcomes people to take the descriptors and play with them and adapt them as learner-facing can-do statements or aims for learning. So this is something that's already happened extensively with language portfolios, for example. I'm going to try moving back and moving forward again. Yeah, okay, that's solved the problem. So we see here an example, processing text in speech, that one we saw earlier of summarizing straightforward texts. That, of course, translates very easily into an activity of researching and presenting a plan for a day out by accessing a range of mini brochures or researching it on the internet, for example. You have source texts, you're being selective in the information you take from those source texts, and you're presenting your ultimate plan for the day out in that target destination. So that's one thing. On the left we see there, research and present a plan for a day out. That's how you could communicate it to the learners. They don't necessarily have to see the raw statement from the CFR. It could also be to work in a group to allocate a budget for the trip. And quite often when you set up group work, having some kind of quantitative aspect to negotiate can be a good way of structuring the discussion and the collaboration. If they all have maybe their own fantasy budget to chip in and agree what to prioritize and what to jettison from the itinerary. But also it might be writing a blog post giving advice for travel to a given destination that they've read about, either through travel brochures or through the internet. And of course, this is something that they could research themselves outside of the lesson before the mediation activity. So it's a real opportunity to think again about how we make use of learners' own perspectives and interests in the classroom. And this diagram represents a cycle that you could join at any point, really. You might be setting learning aims based on mediation activities that are given to the learners, and as learning tasks, they might be challenged to think about topics that they want to present, or they might be challenged with something they have to solve together. And so the assessment side of things in the classroom can work with success criteria regardless of the topic. You might just be using the can-do statements to reflect on how well they approach the task on that level. And the remedial practice then can refer back to the mediation can-do statements as success criteria, but also dig into the language use side of things as well and break it down. And so you get a rich feedback on multiple levels. If you're thinking about how well they mediated, also how well they used the target language. And that feeds into needs analysis, which in turn feeds into further adaptation of the course according to where you've seen strengths and weaknesses in your learners. If we think about mediating a text as a task sequence, then the actual mediation part, you might lead up to that by introducing a topic, then having a reading and listening task which learners exchange their different viewpoints on if they've had differentiated things to look at or they had an information gap, but also leading to some kind of spoken or written task that extends it. And it might even be, for example, reading about a topic and then creating your own video, edutainment video about that with your smartphone. There's a lot of creativity that can come out of thinking, okay, how are we moving across modalities from the reception part to the mediation? And with mediating concepts, your task sequence might begin with introducing the topic and useful language and moving on to a problem-solving task, a collaborative task. And that might also lead to some reporting. So when you have group activities going on in the classroom, think about regrouping, because an initial phase to evaluate, okay, what product are we going to design, might then, with regrouping, lead to reporting on what you did in what you decided in the previous group, and then negotiating a final solution. So regrouping can be a good technique to stimulate mediation in the classroom. And then, of course, feedback and further language work coming out of that. The teacher as monitor can use a lot of delayed feedback to look at both the task achievement and the language control and identify needs in terms of systemic and non-systemic language errors as well. Okay, so finally, our last point here is to make use of self-reflection phases. This can be a good way of engaging learners with the learning aims that you might formulate for mediation, because they do tend to deal with aspects of task achievement. It is a sort of more bird's eye view of successful communication. There are sub-skills that contribute to successful mediation, but it's a useful way to reflect, okay, how successful was I in that task, in getting my point across, or in collaborating, explaining something. And rather than just leaving this to the end of a unit, for example, with a long list of can-do statements to tick off as a kind of bureaucratic exercise, it might be more useful to interleaven this in your practice day to day. Create space in each lesson after tasks that involved some aspect of mediating texts or concepts. It creates space for the learners just to have one or two questions to reflect on, because you introduced that aim at the beginning of the lesson, and then you reflect, okay, how confident do I feel? Maybe rate your confidence rather than I can do it or I can't do it. There's a binary decision. It's more, how confident do I feel now after trying that, and would I like to do it again in the future? And that's what I would call assessment for learning, because it gives success criteria that can be revisited and built upon, rather than just you achieved this or you didn't. Okay, so we've come up to our Q&A. We had a few questions in the middle, but I'm sure there'll be a couple of more questions and maybe comments that came up along the way.
Tim, thank you very much for that. We actually have a whole load of questions and comments that have come along, so I hope we have time to go through them. I may just connect some of these together so that you can perhaps answer them together. So one of these are three sort of comments and questions which are around, so it's a kind of transfer of information. Is it around interpretation, or is it around helping others understand, comprehend something?
Okay. Well, if we say interpretation rather than interpreting, I said earlier that it's not interpreting, which is just a transparent transfer of information without adding or removing anything. Then, yeah, I think that the thing to highlight of the three that you gave there is taking into account communicative needs of others in the way that you formulate your message about something. So the common theme there, if we looked at mediating a text, then you would summarize or paraphrase and use the appropriate language that you feel will be most effective for the people you are talking to or the people you are writing for. But also in a group situation, you will modulate your contributions to be collaborative and constructive, to build on what other people said rather than just, railroad through with your opinion all the time. So again, you're taking into account the communicative needs of the other people in that group. So it does place the learner in as a social actor. This is something that the CFR talks about, is that we're not black boxes walking around with language inside that we just spew out. We are part of society. We are social actors, and the way we communicate needs to be responsive to the social situation that we find ourselves in. And mediation really focuses on that.
Okay, thank you for that, Tim. Just thinking about the questions are coming in, but we do have ones that were asked during the presentation. And this you may want to refer to future webinars. Some of these questions you may want to, in your answers, refer to future webinars. But we have, what is your opinion about assessing linguistic mediation as a totally independent language activity?
What is my opinion? I think it's rather ambitious, and we should refer back to my comment that I don't see mediation as separate from other aspects of communication. So far, what I've seen piloted is more to use it as a category that we look at of success criteria alongside other aspects such as interaction and production. For example, in a spoken or written context. And this is something we did at Eurocenters when I was head of academic development there. We developed criteria for teachers to observe performances, thinking about language control, thinking about interaction, and also thinking about task achievement in terms of mediation. So I think we do have to be careful and take things step by step rather than trying to separate it out in the way that we do with the 4 skills: speaking, listening, reading and writing. It's more about observing how those skills integrate, and therefore it could be a category of your criteria in an assessment rather than being extracted as just an assessment of mediation.
Okay, thank you. So just looking down further questions. So preparing a presentation based on an article or a film, for example, is a form of mediation too? Yes,
it certainly is, because that article or that film is the text that you're mediating. So if you're preparing a presentation based upon that, you are selecting what aspects of that to summarize, to comment upon, and to highlight in the presentation, and that's how the mediation occurs.
Okay, thank you. So what's the difference between a mediation activity and a collaborative activity?
A mediation activity is something that will happen in a collaborative activity. So a collaborative activity is something you set up. We have a goal to do this together, and we're going to collaborate on it. Now, mediation activities are described in terms of how do you get there? Do you build upon the contributions of others, or do you just sit there giving your own opinions and not actually responding to the contributions of others. So it's more about the process than the activity as a whole. This is the use of the word activity in the CFR. When we see can-do statements such as can build on the contributions of others, that is what we call a mediation activity. And it's part of the process that's described and what we can realistically do at that level in the target language.
Okay, thank you. Can you give an example of mediation activities for A1 and A2 learners? And perhaps this is something you may want to refer to for next week.
Yeah, okay, so next week we are going to look at mediation and young learners, so a large part of that is looking at A1 and A2. There are fewer activities described in the CFR at those levels because obviously there are aspects of literacy and communicative competence that underlie a lot of the mediation activities at higher levels. But certainly at lower levels that you can be relaying information. It might even be, for example, working with a timetable at A1 and picking out information from that timetable to relay to your partner in some kind of information gap activity. Something as simple as that. It is described in the CFR, relaying specific information at A1. But we will explore that, and also not necessarily just the descriptors, but the core principles of mediation, how they can still apply and be something that you have in mind in the way that you set up activities and routines in A1 and A2 classes.
Thank you. Practical question here. How can you recommend developing the skills of mediation in groups of students whose levels of English are different or differ a lot, rather?
Well, I think actually, again, you can look at that as an opportunity. If, for example, you are differentiating roles in a collaborative activity, but also if those differentiated levels create opportunities for learners to talk about their topics rather than everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. So if you have mediation activities that draw on learners' own interests, then you can have differentiation in the classroom in the way that they mediate those, the depth to which they go in their presentations or in their pieces of writing. So I think it is possible in mixed ability classes.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're coming towards the end here, and the final one is around how can you teach mediation over Skype, or what sort of issues does that present?
Well, it all depends on which aspects you want to focus on, because over Skype you might be giving someone a text before the Skype and asking them to digest that and then tell you about it. That is a very simple way of practicing mediation over Skype. But also you might be coaching someone over Skype in terms of how they can approach collaborative activities without necessarily doing the collaborative activity in the Skype itself. So it depends whether you're looking at strategies or getting them to mediate a text to you over the Skype and then feeding back on how they did that and the language they used.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all those answers, Tim, some of which are going to come up in the future webinars. I think we have to wind up now because we're over time. But as you can see here, we have got 3 more webinars. I don't know if you wanted to talk very quickly about them, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. So on Thursday the 19th, we'll look at mediation and young learners. As I explained, this is an area where we might be more interested in how we can prepare learners to for their lifelong learning pathway, to be more confident in explaining ideas and collaborating. And it may not necessarily be with the same range of descriptors available, but we just look at general principles of setting up routines in the classroom and so on. And then how can mediation support academic and career skills? It's highly relevant to this area in terms of setting learning aims and outcomes for activities where people process texts and work together to come to solutions. And finally, mediation and assessment. We touched on that with one of the questions just now. It is an area, as I say, that we need to take step by step and not assume that just because you have descriptors of mediation, that translates automatically into a high stakes test for mediation. There are many ways that we can approach assessment, and that can include assessment for learning and continuous assessment and focusing on reflection. Okay, so we've got quite a broad coverage with those 3 remaining webinars, and hopefully they'll be useful.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for your time today. It's been, as I've mentioned before, this is I've been talking to Tim a little bit about this over a while, and it's just interesting to see it explained further and in greater detail as we explore the topic. There is one thing I do want to mention. There is a podcast that Tim recorded, which is more of a relaxed conversation around mediation, where he's asked interesting questions. And it's a very entertaining podcast if you want to explore this topic a bit further. It's available on the website given in the slide. But with that, Tim, thanks a lot for the presentation, and for all of you attending, thank you for coming along and joining us.
Yeah, great pleasure, and thank you for so many people attending. It's great to see you all there. I can see the number. Yeah, great.
Well, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye then. Bye.